With AVP Requiem making a bad situation worse, the Alien series seemed like it had been nuked from orbit. And who knows how long it might have remained that way. With Alien 5 scuttled, James Cameron turned his full attention to an idea he'd been developing 10 years earlier called Project 880, later released as Avatar. More on that in our next part. While he was working on Avatar with 20th Century Fox at the time, there seemed little interest in him returning after the studio had torpedoed his plan for a cash grab that wound up killing the film series. But there was one other person who could reinvigorate it. That is, if he was still interested. And it turns out he was. Ridley Scott still, after all that had come and gone, had a nagging voice in his head about who it was on that derelict spaceship in his film. Working on the Alien quadrilogy, Scott found himself wondering, who the hell was in that ship? Who was sitting in that seat? Why that cargo? Where was he going? He wanted to discover the answers. Fox was very interested in trying to restart the patient's heart, so 18 months after Requiem's critical evisceration, the announcement was made by Tony Scott that an Alien prequel was going to be made. However, Fox quickly got cold feet and insisted that if they were going to save Alien, it needed to be Scott himself wielding the paddle. He would have to direct personally if he wanted to see his prequel being made. Well, he agreed, and the film was instantly made a priority project, driven by Fox's desperate hope to save the series and by Scott's excitement at finally, 30 years later, being able to tell the Alien follow-up that he'd wanted. The story itself came from an unexpected direction. John Spaihts was the screenwriter who would go on to pen the original Doctor Strange film and the Dune epics. At the time, though, he was mostly known for Shadow 19, considered to be one of the top unproduced scripts of its time. Along with Passengers, which would be made nearly a decade later, Spaihts impressed scot-free. The company was a merger of several production companies into a single banner. He was invited to discuss potential work with them. Nothing specific, it was just a general meeting. And the company president, Michael Costigan, asked Spaihts if he had any ideas for an Alien prequel, noting that Ridley Scott wanted to return to the Alien universe, but they'd struggled to crack a story. Spaihts had no idea that this might be coming. Yet rather than having no idea what to say, he found himself overflowing with ideas. He threw out off-the-cuff ideas for the next 30 to 45 minutes until Scott-Free was impressed enough to ask him to come up with a treatment to share with Scott. Alien 01, the master narrative, was the result. Within a week or two, that write-up had made it to Scott himself, who was finishing post-production on Robin Hood, and also to the top executives at Fox. The reaction was enthusiastic, so much so that Spaihts soon found himself in a room with Ridley Scott and Fox's co-chairs. In a matter of days, Alien 01 went from an abstract idea to an active project, and Fox publicly confirmed that Spaihts had been hired to write an Alien prequel with Ridley Scott attached to direct. Years of idle sequel, prequel rumors had finally coalesced into a real development effort and an exploration of a new corner of this universe. From the start, the Alien prequel was conceived as being more than just another monster movie. It was to be a grand exploration of origins, not just of the xenomorphs, but of humanity itself. Scott had mused over the space jockey and what purpose those eggs could possibly serve. He thought maybe the ship could have been a battle wagon or aircraft carrier, perhaps belonging to a biomechanical species involved in some far-reaching ancient conflict with the eggs as biological weapons. The space jockey wouldn't just be some explorer anthropologist, no. They'd be a military servant of a higher civilization. It was a fascinating idea to consider. Rather than an image of a creator as being benevolent, enigmatic, if not unknowable, and profoundly wise, these would have no moral qualms about either using biological weapons or about creating life for no other purpose than to be a weapon. If that was the kind of creator that the space jockey's race were, then what if the xenomorphs weren't their only creation? What if we were another creation? And what happens when creator and creation meet? Their exploration of creation, and the consequences of it, was steeped in influences from philosophy, mythology, and science fiction. Scott and the writers found themselves particularly drawn to the Greek myth of Prometheus, the titan who defied the gods to give fire, symbolizing knowledge, to humanity, only to endure eternal punishment. In fact, Scott initially flirted with the idea of calling the film Alien Paradise, a direct nod to Paradise Lost, with Eden-like themes of creators, gods, and the perilous nature of defying divine edict. The word paradise in this context alluded to the creators of mankind and the profound questions surrounding divine creation that the film aimed to tackle. But in time, the title became Prometheus since it captured these themes: humanity's quest for godlike knowledge, an ambition fraught with danger and unforeseen consequences. This led to a fascinating question. What would happen when mankind, along with an android and the space jockeys race, all met? What would happen when mankind's creators, mankind itself, and the beings mankind created were all in the same room together? What would be the perspectives on the event from each of those three sides? They were excited to explore the possibilities. Like with Alien vs. Predator, Scott returned to the chariots of the gods and the ancient astronaut theories that it embodied. Rather than being alien hunters this time, these were aliens who were engineering early civilization, earning them the name engineers as a result. The plot point of ancient star maps leading to distant planets mirrored these ideas. An ancient civilization on Earth leaving cryptic clues about their celestial visitors. As established, Scott was an admirer of 2001: A Space Odyssey, and he wanted to bring the same Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke philosophical aspect to Prometheus, to make the film something of a hybrid. On the one hand, it would be the same visceral horror that Alien had, but married to 2001's philosophical profundity. Scott made clear he didn't want to return to science fiction unless there was something more than thrills here. He wanted it to contain something deeper, to essentially tap the work that he did on Blade Runner, with its own deep questions about existence inside of an action thriller. But to do it with Alien this time. It was down to Spates then to turn Ridley Scott's grand ambitions into a script. With the big picture view nailed down, Spates set about turning his pitch into a full screenplay. In just 3.5 weeks, he completed the script, a personal record, he said. Over the next year, working in close collaboration with Ridley Scott, he produced 5 major drafts of the script. He got used to Scott's approach of throwing ideas out there that he'd need to find a way to seamlessly incorporate into the story. But the close collaboration ensured that the script would reflect Scott's vision for Prometheus, though for a time it was called Alien Engineers. In its earliest form, the script was clearly an Alien prequel, creating a backstory to the events that led to the ship being on LV-426, where the action was originally set. It was to introduce new characters and provide new mysteries, even as it explored answering Scott's questions. Spates' drafts followed a group of scientists and explorers who discovered ancient clues on Earth that led them to a distant moon. The Magellan, later changed to Prometheus, arrived on LV-426, and we followed female scientist Dr. Watts as she found a complex of pyramids on the planet. These were discovered to be temples, research stations, or both, the remains of the engineer civilization. Inside, the crew would encounter proto-xenomorph creatures after they found a cache of alien eggs in a hidden chamber beneath the pyramid. What began as a quest to find their maker culminates in a confrontation with the engineer's other creation, nightmare creatures, which leads to the ship full of eggs that the Nostromo crew would find later in Alien. Spates' fixation upon the engineers as the originators of the human race came from his belief that the only way to make them interesting was to connect them to us in some way. Either they created the human race or guided human evolution like the monolith of 2001. This would set up a quest to find our makers and find out why we were made and why we might be destroyed. As Scott and the studio provided feedback, the story shifted from being an Alien prequel to a story set within the universe of Alien. Originally, the team were the ones that activated the distress beacon that led the Nostromo to come to LV-426. But given the changes, it seemed that if they shifted it to a different world, LV-223, that they'd then have more freedom for events to unfold without having to worry about contradicting the events of Alien or aliens. The engineer's ship, identical to the one from Alien, was dubbed the Juggernaut and was hidden underneath one of the pyramids, which would be revealed as a launch silo and allow for a dynamic third act. Spaihts' later drafts also introduced ideas like an elaborate scene involving an underwater archaeological excavation on Earth and a massive space station called Weyland's Wheel as an orbital base that belonged to Peter Weyland, and possibly another allusion to 2001. Eventually, these were cut to streamline the story, focusing instead upon a simple progression: discovery of ancient star maps on Earth, a $1 trillion expedition led by Weyland Industries, arrival at an alien installation, exploration of engineer ruins, and the unfolding of engineer's deadly experiment with the humans caught in the middle. By April 2010, Spaihts was on his fourth major draft, and much of the core structure that audiences later saw was in place. However, as the script neared production, both Scott and the studio felt one more final round of refinement was needed to make it ready for filming. In mid-2010, with pre-production gearing up, the pivotal decision was made to have another writer make a revision to the script. Spaihts himself wasn't surprised. It was common to have a fresh writer to polish a high-profile project, especially when, despite the acclaim for his work, none of Spaihts' scripts had actually been turned into studio films yet. The one approached for the job was Damon Lindelof, at the time most known as the co-creator of Lost. Scott personally reached out to Lindelof and sent him a copy of the fifth draft of the script, at the time titled Alien Zero, to get his input. Lindelof thought it was a great script full of exciting and original ideas, but that it was far too focused upon the well-tread ground of the alien creatures. As weird as it might sound for what had started as an intent to both create an Alien prequel and revitalize the Alien series, Fox, Scott, and Lindelof decided what this film really needed to do was move away from Alien. Tom Rothman, the one who hobbled the Alien vs. Predator film effort with his interference, backed the idea of avoiding doing the easy thing and leaning on Alien. This might have been to avoid anything to antagonize Ridley Scott, whom the studio felt was the only one who could save Alien at this point, even if he was interested in drawing back from the series' titular monsters towards the larger mythos. Fox had upset Scott with the poor advertising rollout of the acclaimed Kingdom of Heaven, and it seemed that Rothman was more interested in building a solid professional relationship with Scott than worrying about the Alien property itself. Scott would go on to work exclusively with Fox for the next several years, with 4 additional films that culminated in the hit adaptation of Andy Weir's The Martian. It seemed that Fox was willing to indulge Scott on the Alien film and trust his judgment. Thus the edict came down: remove the xenomorphs and lean more on the engineers. Remove the monsters and instead turn Spaihts' subtext into text. No one felt the prior script was bad, and indeed, Lindelof praised the strong foundation it provided. But what was needed was a change in tone and emphasis, he said, and to have the third act more reflect the deeper questions rather than becoming a monster movie in the third act. Spaihts' version had multiple xenomorph-like creatures, with a queen emerging for a final battle on the Juggernaut. Lindelof cut all of that down to a single proto-xenomorph emerging, called the Deacon, and existing mostly just as a wink to the audience that this was indeed an Alien film, despite the Deacon not actually doing anything. As Spaihts later summarized, the farther we'd pushed into development, the bigger the engineers got and the more marginalized the original alien monster became, until that monster became a kind of grace note in a larger story that was about humanity meeting its makers. This led to many points coming from nowhere or going nowhere. As established, the Deacon did nothing but appear for a few seconds. The facehugger was replaced by an eel, only for the offspring to emerge from the corpse and never be seen again. The assault on the ship was inexplicably by a super zombie with no explanation of how their dead colleague, killed by acid melting his helmet to his face, suddenly returned as a hostile reanimated killing machine. Lindelof spent the next 7 to 8 months trying to rebuild the script around Ridley Scott's ideas and themes. In story meetings, Scott would expound on big questions. Where do we come from? What if our makers are alien? What responsibility do creators have to their creations? Following this road led to the unexpected deepening of the role of David Eight, the the android. The creator-creation theme was written to show that even as the humans were seeking their alien creators, David was seeking approval from his creator, Wayland, while harboring ambivalence towards humanity. We'll get a bit more into David in our next part, but we should note that Lindelof also added elements of the kind of mystery and ambiguity that were both famous and infamous on Lost into here. Questions such as why the engineers decided to wipe out humanity were being left intentionally unanswered, the idea being that it would give the film a sense of depth and mystique. However, some of this wound up seeming less like mystique and more like plot convenience, such as the aforementioned super zombie, and the random consequences of the so-called black goo, from the spontaneous generation of killer eels to the creation of an enormous squid-like monster after Shaw was impregnated by sleeping with her infected boyfriend. It seemed that mystique had the same aspect that had plagued Lost, that it was not an explanation, it was an excuse. By the end of 2010, the work had so changed that Fox dropped the word alien from the title, positioning it as a story within the larger Alien universe, but not directly tied to the iconic monsters. Entirely new ideas were to be realized in this film. Unusually, the visual design process for Prometheus ran in parallel with the writing. As early as Spade's fourth draft, which was spring of 2010, with Ridley Scott formally on board, the production's art department was actively designing the creatures, sets, and visuals intended for the film. Spates would discuss scenes with concept artists one day, and by the very next morning, paintings of those scenes would be hanging on the wall. According to executive producer Michael Ellenberg, the concept work on this movie was sort of its own script work, taking place alongside the actual script work. Ideas were being developed visually even as they were being written, each informing the other. The designers visualized the look of the engineers' pyramid interior and the giant humanoid engineers themselves, while Spate's scenes involving them were still evolving. This collaborative feedback loop helped to refine the story. If an artwork suggested a particularly powerful image or set piece, the script could be adjusted to highlight it. This is no surprise, as Ridley Scott is known for his strong visual instincts, and so encouraged this process, even personally overseeing much of the concept art development. In fact, he pulled out discarded concept art from way back in '78 to help encourage ideas for what this film could explore. By the time Spate's script was nearing completion, a rich portfolio of design work had already shaped the world, from the star map cave paintings and engineer murals to the new creature designs sprouting from the black goo. Aesthetically, early design discussions aimed to blend the biomechanical imagery of Alien with grander concepts of antiquity and godhood. The engineers were envisioned as imposing godlike figures with an air of classical beauty. Scott instructed the artist to imagine the engineers as if Michelangelo's David came to life. Early concept art depicted them as towering humanoid beings with pale skin and classical facial features. The intent was for them to embody the supremacy and nobility of Imperial Rome, yet combined with the creative powers of the ancient Greeks. Far from H.R. Giger's nightmarish biomechanical creations that had inspired Scott 30 years earlier, the focus was now on creating beings that were the epitome of marble-like perfection. As things progressed, Scott also drew in the Statue of Liberty for inspiration, and finally, and most surprisingly, someone you would likely never put in the same category as her and Michelangelo's David, Elvis Presley. It wasn't, as the concept artist noted, something that would leap out at you, but it was the blend of the three figures that reflected what Scott felt was enigmatic and otherworldly, while also seeming mythologically familiar. Throughout all of this, Ridley Scott and the writers also collaborated on ancillary world building that extended from the film's development notes. As Scott had with Alien, elaborate backstories were created, and extra details were worked out to inform the performances and future planning. One example was that the engineers were headed to Earth 2,000 years ago to wipe out humanity, and also that the moon LV-223 was a military installation. Pieces of lore that came out of these creative sessions that were hinted at in the film, but not made explicit or explained. This was further evidenced by an elaborate viral marketing campaign, the Peter Whalen TED Talk, for instance, which Lindelof and Scott had a hand in, to expand the Prometheus universe beyond the film itself. The backstory allowed for all of these to emerge organically later on. By the time cameras rolled, the creative team had a very detailed understanding of the film's fictional universe, from the engineers' ancient civilization, their verge of godhood, as one early document called it, to the technology of the Prometheus ship, largely because those details had been hashed out in the process of making the story believable and grand, as per Scott's mandate. As Lindelof's script neared its final form, the production machinery was in full swing. Ridley Scott's creative team, many of whom had worked with him on previous epics, were assembling the pieces needed to realize Prometheus. Arthur Max, production designer, and other department heads began translating the concept art and script descriptions into huge practical sets, such as the towering engineer head chamber and the juggernaut spacecraft interior. Scott pushed for building as much as possible practically, reserving CGI for enhancing scale. Scott wanted the film to deal with heady philosophical matters, yet still feel like it was very grounded. As established, Fox was more than willing to indulge him on this film, with a budget of $120 million, 11 times that of the original film. The design aesthetic of Prometheus worked to blend the old and the new. The engineered temple, nicknamed the Pyramid or Ampule Room, was intended to invoke the eerie biomechanical style of H.R. Giger's art, with walls inscribed by strange glyphs and a giant stone head dominating the chamber. But the black goo and sacrificial altar were to bring a new mystique to the place. The creature design team, which included Neville Page among others, crafted the new eel, squid, and deacon to echo but differentiate from Giger's work. Even Giger's space jockey was changed, now revealed to be an engineer wearing an exosuit, allowing Scott to explore the mysterious pilot while keeping his statuesque creators looking human. But the preparation was over, and it was time for Ridley Scott and his team to be the creators themselves, in finally making his first alien-related work in more than 30 years.